"You embarrassed me in front of everyone, Dad." Those were the first words my son said after the glass hit the side of my head and shattered across the white tablecloth at my youngest daughter's engagement party in downtown Chicago. I still remember the sound of my daughter Ava screaming, the sharp smell of whiskey in the air, and the way the entire ballroom suddenly went silent except for the slow drip of liquid sliding off my jacket sleeve onto the hardwood floor. Lucas stood there breathing hard, his face red with anger, pointing at the old military watch I had handed him only seconds earlier. "Nobody wants your dead man trash," he snapped loud enough for every guest to hear. My wife Diane didn't rush to help me. She didn't even ask if I was okay. Instead, she crossed her arms and looked at me with exhaustion in her eyes. "Nathan, you always know how to ruin a night," she muttered. My future son-in-law stared at the floor. My granddaughter started crying near the dessert table. And me? I just stood there at 74 years old with whiskey soaking through my shirt while my own son looked at me like I was some pathetic old man he could throw away whenever he felt like it. Before I tell you what happened next, I just want to say this. If this story truly resonates with you, and if you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, maybe take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel only if this story speaks to your heart. And wherever you're watching from tonight, leave your city, your country, and your local time down in the comments. I always read them before bed. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 74 years old, and the night my son humiliated me in front of 200 people was the night everything inside my family finally broke apart. But to understand how a man ends up bleeding quietly in a crowded ballroom while his own family watches in silence, you have to go back to where all of this really began. The party had started beautifully. Ava rented the entire top floor of the Lakeshore Grand Hotel overlooking Lake Michigan. There were gold lights hanging from the ceiling, jazz music playing near the bar, and snow falling softly outside the giant glass windows. For a few hours, I almost believed we were still a normal family. Lucas arrived 40 minutes late wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my first pickup truck back in 1972. The moment he walked in, the room changed. He had that effect on people. Loud voice, big personality, always needing attention. "There he is," Diane said proudly the second he entered. "My successful son." I noticed she didn't say our son anymore. She'd stopped saying that years ago. Lucas hugged everybody except me. He shook hands with investors, laughed with Ava's fiancé, ordered 18-year whiskey at the bar, and barely looked in my direction. Still, I told myself not to let it bother me. Fathers spend half their lives pretending things don't hurt. Around 9:30, Ava clinked her champagne glass and announced she wanted family members to say something meaningful before dessert. People laughed. Couples kissed. Phones came out for pictures. Diane gave a speech about love and commitment. Ava cried halfway through hers. Then everyone turned toward me. "Dad," Ava said softly, "do you want to say something?" I wasn't planning to, but I stood up slowly anyway. My knees hurt from the cold that week. I remember reaching into the inside pocket of my blazer and feeling the small velvet box in my hand. "Lucas," I said, looking at my son, "this belonged to your grandfather." The room quieted immediately. Even Lucas looked surprised. I opened the box carefully and held up the old silver military watch my father carried during Vietnam. "Your grandfather wore this every day for 31 years, I told him. "And before he died, he asked me to pass it down to the man in our family strong enough to protect the people he loves." For one second, I thought I saw emotion in Lucas's eyes. Real emotion. But then he laughed. Not nervous laughter. Mean laughter. The kind that cuts deeper because everyone around you hears it too. "You seriously brought this?" he said. "Dad, this thing probably belongs in a pawn shop." A few uncomfortable chuckles came from one of his friends near the bar. I felt my chest tighten. "Lucas," Ava whispered sharply. "Stop." But he kept going. "You know what your problem is?" he said, stepping closer to me. "You think giving people old junk makes you important." I lowered the box slowly. "It's not junk," I replied quietly. "It's family." Lucas grabbed the whiskey glass from the table beside him. "No," he snapped. "It's guilt. That's all you ever give people." And then his hand jerked suddenly through the air. The room gasped as the glass flew past my face and exploded against the side of my head. For a second, nobody moved. I touched the side of my temple and looked down at the blood on my fingertips while shattered ice cubes slid across the tablecloth beside the engagement cake. My own son stared at me without remorse. And that was the exact moment I realized something terrifying. The people standing around me that night had no idea who actually owned everything they depended on. And Lucas had absolutely no idea what I had already discovered about him 3 days earlier. 3 days before Ava's engagement party, I was sitting alone in my office on the 42nd floor of Coal Freight Logistics, watching snow move across downtown Chicago, when I opened a folder I was never supposed to see. It started with one strange phone call from my accountant, Martin Reyes. "Nathan," he said quietly over the line, "I think you should come in person." Martin had worked with me for 26 years. He was not the type of man who panicked. So when I walked into his office that afternoon and saw 3 binders spread across his desk, I already knew something inside my life had shifted. "Tell me straight," I said. Martin adjusted his glasses and slid one of the binders toward me. "Lucas has been moving money through shell accounts." At first, I thought it had to be some mistake. My son had always been reckless with money, but fraud? No, not Lucas. Not the little boy who used to fall asleep on my chest while I watched Sunday football on our old couch back in Joliet. But then Martin opened the files one by one. Wire transfers, loan applications, signatures that looked almost exactly like mine. "This account was opened 14 months ago," Martin explained. "And this one 6 months later." I stared at the pages. Without speaking, the room suddenly felt smaller. "How much?" I finally asked. Martin hesitated before answering. "A little over $4.2 million. I leaned back slowly in the chair and felt something cold move through my stomach. 4.2 million. That was not bad spending habits. That was betrayal planned carefully over time. And the worst part was not even the money. It was realizing how long everyone around me had expected me to keep cleaning up Lucas's messes without ever questioning him. Looking back now, maybe it started when he was 12. That was the year Diane stopped treating him like a son and started treating him like a king. I still remember one December morning in 1999. Ava was helping me shovel snow outside our house while Lucas stayed inside playing video games. "Tell your brother to help," I told Diane from the garage. She barely looked up from her coffee. "He is tired," she said. "Football practice wore him out." Ava heard every word while standing ankle-deep in snow wearing gloves 2 sizes too big because Lucas had lost the new pair we bought her the week before. Later that same winter, Lucas crashed my Ford pickup into a mailbox after sneaking out with friends. He was 16. I told him he would have to pay for repairs himself. Diane exploded at me in the kitchen. "He made a mistake," she snapped. "Why are you always harder on him than the girls?" I remember laughing bitterly because the truth was exactly the opposite. Lucas got everything. New cars, expensive schools, bailouts, excuses. Meanwhile, Ava worked double shifts at a diner during college because she refused to ask me for money after hearing Diane complain for years about wasting resources on daughters who would eventually get married anyway. There was one night I still cannot forget. Lucas had been suspended from Northwestern after getting caught cheating on an exam. He was 21 years old and sitting at our dining table with his arms crossed while Diane rubbed his shoulder like he was the victim. "Dad," he said coldly, "if you had actually supported me instead of controlling everything, maybe I would not have needed help." I stared at him in disbelief. "You cheated," I replied. "Nobody forced you to do that." Diane slammed her hand against the counter. "You always make him feel small," she shouted at me. "No wonder he resents you." That sentence stayed with me for years because part of me actually believed it. Fathers blame themselves for everything. That is what nobody tells you. We work 70-hour weeks. We miss birthdays. We destroy our backs trying to provide. Then when things fall apart, we still ask ourselves if maybe we should have hugged our children more. Maybe we should have listened better. Maybe we should have been softer. But sitting in Martin's office staring at those fake signatures, I finally understood something painful. Lucas did not resent me because I failed him. He resented me because every time he crossed a line, somebody in that house taught him there would never be consequences. Martin closed the final binder slowly and looked me straight in the eye. "Nathan," he said carefully, "there is something else you need to know." And the moment he spoke those words, I realized the money was not even the worst part. Martin reached into the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a thin gray envelope that already had my name typed across the front. The second I saw it, something inside me tightened. "What is this?" I asked quietly. Martin did not answer right away. He just slid the envelope across the desk and folded his hands together. "Open it." I remember hearing the hum of traffic 42 floors below us, while snow tapped softly against the office windows. My fingers suddenly felt heavier than they should have as I pulled out the papers inside. The first page was a life insurance policy. The second page nearly stopped my heart. Lucas Cole listed himself as sole successor beneficiary over assets that were never supposed to be altered without my written approval. Properties, trust accounts, corporate shares, retirement funds, millions of dollars quietly repositioned over the last 18 months. That is impossible, I whispered. Those accounts require dual authorization. Martin nodded slowly. They do. I looked up at him. Then how did this happen? He hesitated again, before speaking. Because someone inside your family gave him access. I stared at him without blinking. Who? Martin lowered his voice. Diane. For a few seconds, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. My wife and I had been married 39 years. 39 years of mortgages, surgeries, Christmas mornings, funerals, graduations, late-night emergency rooms, and dinners eaten half cold because one of us was always working. And suddenly I was sitting there learning that while I had been trying to hold our family together, the two people closest to me had quietly been building an exit plan around me. No, I said immediately. Diane would never do that. But even as I spoke, memories started lining up in my head like falling dominoes. The private conversations that stopped when I entered the room. The documents Lucas always volunteered to help organize. The afternoon Diane insisted I transfer temporary authority access while recovering from my heart procedure last spring. It is just precautionary, she had told me at the time while squeezing my hand in the hospital room. You need to rest and let the kids help. I closed my eyes slowly. Martin leaned forward carefully. Nathan, I need to ask you something difficult. I looked at him. Did you ever actually review the revised trust paperwork from last year? And that was the moment I realized I had not. I trusted my family so completely that I signed whatever Diane placed in front of me without question. Every retirement update, every trust revision, every banking adjustment. Because after almost 4 decades of marriage, you stop imagining betrayal. You stop checking the locks on your own house. I stood up from the chair and walked toward the window overlooking Lake Michigan. The city looked gray and cold beneath the snow. What happens now? I finally asked. Martin was quiet for a moment. That depends on you. I laughed softly under my breath. No, it depends on whether my family thinks I am still the same man. Later that evening, I drove home through freezing rain and sat in my driveway for almost 20 minutes without turning off the engine. The lights inside the house glowed warm against the dark January sky. Diane was probably making tea. Lucas was probably texting somebody about another investment idea with money that did not belong to him. For most of my life, I would have walked inside quietly, avoided conflict, and convinced myself I could fix everything with patience. But something inside me had changed during that drive home. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was age. Or maybe it was finally realizing that love without respect eventually turns into permission. When I walked through the front door, Diane looked up from the kitchen island. You are late, she said casually. Lucas stopped by earlier. I loosened my coat slowly and placed my keys on the counter. Normally, I would have asked about her day. Normally, I would have smiled and pretended everything was fine. But this time I simply looked at her and said, Did he tell you how much money he moved? The color drained from her face so fast it almost frightened me. Nathan, she whispered immediately, do not start this tonight. I stared at her quietly for several seconds. Then for the first time in nearly 40 years, I did not apologize, I did not soften my tone, and I did not back down. I just turned around and walked upstairs while Diane stood frozen in the kitchen behind me. And as I reached the top step, my phone buzzed with a message from Lucas that made the blood run cold through my veins. Dad. The text read, We need to talk before you do something stupid. I did not answer Lucas's text that night. I sat alone in my study upstairs with the lamp off, staring out at the snow collecting across our backyard while my phone kept vibrating against the desk every few minutes. First Lucas. Then Diane. Then even Ava. It was strange how quickly panic spreads through a family once the person they depend on stops responding the way they expect. Around midnight, Diane finally knocked softly on the study door before stepping inside without waiting for permission. Nathan, she said carefully, you are scaring everybody. I almost laughed hearing that. After everything I had just discovered, somehow I was the one frightening people. She sat down across from me, wearing the same cream-colored sweater she always wore when she wanted sympathy. Lucas made mistakes, she continued softly. But he is under pressure. I looked at her for a long moment. $4.2 million is not pressure, Diane. Her eyes immediately hardened. You always exaggerate things. That sentence hit harder than she realized because it was the same sentence she had used for years anytime Lucas crossed a line. When he wrecked cars. When he failed classes. When he disappeared for 3 days during his first marriage. When collectors started calling the house. Every disaster became temporary. Every lie became stress. Every betrayal became my overreaction. Did you help him access the trust? I asked quietly. Diane looked away toward the bookshelf instead of answering me directly. Lucas said you were becoming forgetful, she muttered. I felt my chest tighten instantly. What? She crossed her arms defensively. He was worried about the company. About your health. About your heart medication. I stared at her in disbelief. So the two of you decided I was mentally unstable? Nobody said unstable. Then say the word you used. Silence filled the room. Finally she whispered it. Declining. I leaned back slowly in my chair because suddenly everything from the past year started making horrible sense. The repeated questions about retirement. Lucas insisting on joining executive meetings he had no qualifications for. Diane encouraging me to take it easy whenever I challenged financial decisions. Even Ava asking me twice whether I had accidentally repeated stories during Thanksgiving dinner. They had all been hearing the same narrative behind my back for months. Lucas was preparing the family to doubt me before I ever suspected him. How long? I asked quietly. Diane rubbed her forehead. Nathan, please do not make this ugly. How long? I repeated. Almost a year. A whole year. A whole year my own family had been slowly coached into seeing me as a fading old man instead of the person who built every piece of stability they had. I stood up and walked toward the window because suddenly the room felt too small to breathe in. Downstairs I could hear the dishwasher running, and the television murmuring faintly in the family room like nothing in our lives had changed. Do you know what hurts the most? I asked without turning around. Diane's voice softened. Nathan, it is not even the money. I swallowed hard. It is realizing nobody defended me because all of you already decided I was becoming disposable. Diane stood up quickly. That is not fair. I turned toward her. Was it fair when Lucas told people at the company I could not remember contracts? Her face froze. That was how I knew it was true before she even spoke. He only said that because investors were nervous, she whispered. I felt something inside me finally crack open. Not anger. Something colder than anger. Clarity. I walked downstairs without another word while Diane followed behind me calling my name. In the kitchen, I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator and pulled out the old leather folder where we kept emergency family documents. Diane immediately panicked. Nathan, stop. I ignored her and opened the folder right there on the counter. Insurance papers, property deeds, medical authorizations, and sitting near the back was a folded document I had never seen before. My hands suddenly went numb as I opened it slowly under the kitchen light. Temporary executive succession authorization. My signature sat at the bottom of the page. Except it was not my signature. It was close enough to fool strangers, but not close enough to fool me. I looked up at Diane while my entire body went cold, and the expression on her face told me she already knew the moment everything had finally fallen apart. By sunrise the next morning, the entire house felt different. Not louder, not calmer, just colder. Like everyone inside, it suddenly understood that something irreversible had happened during the night. Diane barely looked at me over breakfast. She moved around the kitchen nervously while pretending to wipe already clean countertops. Around 8:15, my phone started ringing nonstop. First Lucas, then Ava, then even my younger daughter Emily from Denver, who almost never called before noon because of her hospital shifts. I ignored every single one. After 39 years of being the man who fixed every problem the second somebody panicked, silence became the only control I had left. Around 9:30, an email from Lucas appeared in my inbox with the subject line, Dad, please read. I opened it slowly while sitting alone in my office downtown. Dad, I think things got misunderstood last night. Mom is upset. Ava is crying. You disappearing like this is hurting everybody. We can work this out as a family if you stop listening to outsiders trying to turn you against us. Outsiders. That word almost made me laugh. After everything I had discovered, I was somehow the unreasonable one because I finally listened to someone telling me the truth. 20 minutes later, another message came through, this time from Diane. Nathan, please answer your phone. Lucas made mistakes, but he is still your son. Families survive things like this every day. Do not destroy everything over paperwork. Paperwork. That was what they were calling forged signatures, hidden transfers, manipulated trust documents, and months of quiet character assassination behind my back. By lunchtime, the campaign had already spread beyond the house. One of my senior managers, David Lynn, knocked carefully on my office door. Nathan, he said awkwardly, there are rumors downstairs. I looked up from my desk. What kind of rumors? David hesitated. People are saying you may be stepping away from the company because of cognitive issues. I just stared at him for a moment. And who started that conversation? He swallowed hard. Lucas mentioned concerns during a board dinner 2 weeks ago. There it was again. Not one cruel explosion. Not one dramatic betrayal. A slow, organized erosion of my credibility piece by piece until people would naturally stop trusting me without ever realizing they had been manipulated into it. Do you believe it? I asked quietly. David looked embarrassed. Honestly, I did not know what to think. That answer hurt more than if he had outright said yes, because it meant the lie had already started working. Around 3 o'clock, I finally listened to one of Lucas's voicemails. His tone had completely changed from confident to desperate. Dad, come on, he said sharply. You are blowing this way out of proportion. The restructuring was temporary. Investors needed reassurance. We were trying to protect the company. Then his voice hardened slightly near the end. Do not forget who actually runs things day to day now. I replayed that last sentence 3 times. Not because it scared me, because it revealed exactly how deeply he believed the illusion he had built. Around sunset, a courier arrived at my office carrying a handwritten letter from Ava. My youngest daughter had always been the peacekeeper in the family, the one who called both sides after arguments, the one who apologized for problems she did not create. Her letter was only 2 pages long. Dad, she wrote, I know you are hurt, but everybody is scared right now. Lucas says you have been isolating yourself and making impulsive decisions. Mom thinks stress is affecting your judgment. I do not know what to believe anymore. I stopped reading right there because those 8 words nearly crushed me more than everything else combined. I do not know what to believe anymore. That was the true damage Lucas had caused. Not just financial betrayal. He had poisoned trust itself. He had slowly rewritten me inside my own family until the people I loved no longer knew whether to see me as a father or a problem to manage. That night, I drove home after dark and sat in the driveway again without going inside. Snow covered the front lawn in smooth white silence, while warm yellow light glowed through the windows where my family was eating dinner without me. I could see shadows moving through the dining room. Laughter once or twice. Normal life continuing while mine quietly collapsed. And for the first time since I built that house 22 years earlier, I realized I no longer felt like I belonged inside it at all. That night, I did not go inside the house. I started the engine again, backed slowly out of the driveway, and drove through downtown Chicago with no real destination in mind. Snow drifted across the empty streets while old jazz music played softly through the speakers, and somewhere around midnight, I found myself parked outside St. Matthew's Cemetery on the north side of the city. I had not visited my father's grave in almost 8 months. The cold air hit hard when I stepped out of the car. My knees ached walking through the snow-covered paths between headstones, but I kept going until I reached the small granite marker with his name carved into it. William Cole, 1939 to 2011. United States Army. Beloved father. I stood there in silence for a long time before finally speaking out loud. I think I failed them, I whispered. My breath floated white into the freezing air. Or maybe I failed myself. My father used to tell me something when I was young. A man can survive being hated, he would say, but he cannot survive being useful without being loved. I never understood what he meant back then because I spent my entire life believing providing for people was the same thing as building a family. Bigger house, better schools, trust funds, vacations in Florida, paid mortgages. Every sacrifice felt like love to me. But standing there alone at 74 years old, I realized something painful. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being seen as a person and became a system everybody depended on. A provider, a fixer, an account balance with a pulse. Around 1:30 in the morning, my phone rang again. This time it was Emily from Denver. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Dad?" she said softly the second I picked up. I closed my eyes hearing her voice because unlike everyone else lately, she sounded worried about me instead of worried about money. "I am here," I replied quietly. There was a pause. Ava told me what happened. Snow crunched beneath my shoes as I slowly sat down on a frozen bench facing my father's grave. "I should have seen it sooner," I murmured. Emily sighed softly. "Dad, Lucas has been spiraling for years. And I kept rescuing him." "Yes," she answered honestly. That word stayed hanging in the cold night air between us. Not cruel, not judgmental, just true. "Mom says you are shutting everyone out," Emily added carefully. I laughed quietly under my breath. "Your mother spent a year helping your brother convince people I was losing my mind." Emily did not defend her. That silence told me more than words could have. Finally, she said, "Dad, there is something I need to tell you." I gripped the phone tighter. "What?" "Last spring after your surgery, Lucas asked me to sign papers saying I supported temporary control changes at the company." My stomach tightened instantly. "Did you sign them?" "No," her voice cracked slightly. "But Ava did." I lowered my head slowly into my hand. Even now, even after everything, Ava probably still believed she was helping keep the family together. That was the tragedy of people raised around manipulation. They mistake obedience for peace. Emily spoke again after a long pause. "Dad, you sound tired." I looked across the cemetery at rows of silent graves disappearing into darkness. "I am tired," I admitted. And for the first time in my life, I did not mean physically. By the time I drove to a small hotel near O'Hare Airport, the sky was beginning to lighten faintly over the city. I checked into a quiet room on the 6th floor and sat alone at the edge of the bed staring at my reflection in the dark television screen. My face looked older than I remembered, not because of age, because betrayal ages people differently. It hollows them out from the inside. Around 7 in the morning, I finally opened my phone again. 43 missed calls, 12 voicemails, 17 text messages, one new email from Martin Reyes. Subject line: "Nathan, you need to see this immediately." I opened the attachment slowly while morning light crept through the hotel curtains. The document was a confidential board recommendation drafted 2 weeks earlier. At the bottom of the page sat 6 signatures supporting an emergency vote to remove me permanently as chief executive officer of my own company. And right there beneath Lucas's name was Diane's. For the next 4 days, I disappeared completely. I turned off my primary phone, left the hotel near O'Hare before sunrise, and drove north through Wisconsin with no clear plan except one simple thought repeating inside my head over and over again. If my own family had already decided I was finished, then maybe it was time to stop. Standing in the middle of my own funeral. By the second night, I reached a small lakeside town outside Bayfield where winter covered everything in silence. I rented a modest cabin overlooking frozen water and unpacked exactly 1 suitcase. 2 sweaters, work boots, prescription medicine, my father's old watch. That was all I brought from the life I spent 40 years building. The first morning there, I woke up before dawn and made coffee in complete silence. No conference calls, no family group messages, no one needing money, approval, signatures, solutions, or apologies. Just wind moving through pine trees outside the cabin window. And for the first time in years, my chest did not feel tight when I opened my eyes. Around 8 o'clock, Martin Reyes called from a secure number I had given him before leaving Chicago. "Nathan," he said immediately, "the board meeting was moved up." I sat down slowly at the small wooden table beside the fireplace. "When?" "Tomorrow morning." I stared out at the frozen lake. "Lucas is pushing hard." Martin exhaled quietly. He already introduced himself to investors as acting successor. Hearing those words should have broken me. Instead, something strange happened. I felt calm. Not because the betrayal hurt less. Because I finally understood it completely. Lucas never wanted reconciliation. He wanted control. "File the injunctions," I said calmly. Martin paused for a second. "All of them. Every single one." There was silence on the line before he answered quietly, "Understood." That afternoon, I drove 20 miles into town and bought groceries from a small family-owned market where nobody knew my name. The cashier, an older woman wearing thick glasses and a Green Bay Packers sweatshirt, smiled warmly while scanning my items. "You new around here?" she asked. Looks that way, I replied. She laughed softly. Winter is not exactly tourist season. I almost smiled for the first time in days. Maybe I am not here for tourism. Outside the market, I noticed an old pickup truck struggling to start in the freezing parking lot. A young man in his 20s kept turning the key while muttering under his breath. Without thinking, I walked over. Battery connection is loose, I told him. He looked surprised. You know trucks? I nodded once. 20 minutes later, the engine finally turned over. Man, thank you, he said gratefully. I would have been stuck here all night. I wiped my hands with a rag from the truck bed. Sometimes things just need tightening before they fall apart completely. The kid laughed without realizing how serious I was. His name was Caleb. He ran a small freight repair garage outside town with his uncle. When he heard I spent decades in logistics, his eyes widened. Wait, he said carefully, you are Nathan Cole? I looked at him sharply. How do you know that name? My uncle talks about you all the time, he replied. Cole Freight basically changed Midwest shipping routes back in the 90s. That night, Caleb's uncle Frank invited me to their garage for dinner. The place smelled like engine oil, coffee, and old wood smoke. Men worked with their hands there. They looked each other in the eye when speaking. Nobody cared about stock options or family politics. Halfway through dinner, Frank leaned back in his chair and studied me quietly. You do not look retired, he said. I stared down at my coffee mug for a moment before answering. I do not think I ever really knew who I was without work. Frank nodded slowly. Then maybe this is your chance to find out. Those words stayed with me long after I returned to the cabin that night. Around midnight, I opened my laptop for the first time since leaving Chicago and checked the company news feed. Lucas had scheduled a press appearance for the following week announcing a new leadership era for Cole Freight Logistics. I stared at the article for a long moment before finally closing the screen. Because what Lucas still did not understand was this. He thought I disappeared because I was defeated, but the truth was far more dangerous. I had finally stopped trying to save people who were willing to destroy me. 3 weeks after I disappeared from Chicago, my hands finally stopped shaking every morning. It happened so gradually, I almost did not notice it at first. One day, I simply woke up before sunrise in that little cabin. Outside Bayfield, walked outside into the freezing Wisconsin air, and realized my mind felt quiet again. Not empty, just quiet. The kind of quiet a man forgets exists after spending decades surrounded by pressure, noise, demands, and disappointment. By then I had started spending most afternoons at Frank and Caleb's freight garage near Highway 13. At first I only helped with small things. Inventory systems, dispatch schedules, vendor contracts. But after 40 years in logistics, patterns become second nature. Within 10 days, I identified fuel waste issues that were costing them nearly $80,000 a year. 2 weeks later, I renegotiated shipping routes with suppliers across Minnesota and northern Michigan that cut delivery delays almost in half. One snowy Thursday morning, Caleb walked into the office holding fresh employee jackets in his arms. Frank had these made, he said with a grin. He tossed one onto the desk in front of me. I unfolded the heavy navy work jacket slowly. Stitched over the chest in white lettering were the words, North Ridge Freight Solutions. Underneath that was another line. Operations Director, Nathan Cole. I stared at it longer than I probably should have. Caleb laughed softly. You hate it. I shook my head slowly. No, I replied quietly. I just have not seen my name attached to honest work in a long time. That afternoon, Frank slapped the side of a shipment manifest and pointed toward the loading docks where trucks rolled through falling snow. You see that? He asked. Since you got here, everybody works calmer. Drivers trust the system now. I looked out through the office window at mechanics moving between trailers in thick winter jackets, while diesel engines rumbled through the cold air. Nobody there cared about my money. Nobody cared about my family name. They respected competence, reliability, presence. Things I had forgotten still mattered. One evening after closing, Caleb handed me a beer while we sat beside a portable heater near the garage bays. Can I ask you something? He said. Go ahead. Why did somebody like you disappear to a place like this? Snow drifted past the open bay doors while I thought about the answer. Because somewhere along the way, I finally said, I built a life where everybody needed me, but nobody really saw me. Caleb nodded slowly like he understood more than I expected a 27-year-old to understand. My dad was like that, he admitted quietly. worked himself into the ground, trying to hold everybody together. I stared into the amber bottle in my hands. Did it work? Caleb gave a sad little laugh. Not really. By February, word had quietly spread through northern Wisconsin that North Ridge Freight was expanding faster than expected. Small companies from Duluth, Green Bay, and Minneapolis started calling for consultations. Drivers asked specifically whether the old Chicago logistics guy would oversee their routes personally. Frank even cleared out the larger office near the dispatch floor and mounted a brass nameplate outside the door. Nathan Cole, Director of Operations. The first time I saw that plate under the fluorescent lights, something shifted inside me. Not pride exactly. Something healthier. Recognition. For the first time in years, I was becoming someone instead of merely recovering from someone else's damage. And strangely enough, the farther I got from my old life, the more clearly I started seeing it. One Friday evening, while reviewing freight reports beside the window, my work phone buzzed with a Chicago area code I recognized instantly. Ava. I let it ring twice before answering. Dad. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. I did not know if this number still worked. I looked out across the snowy truck yard while mechanics guided a trailer into docking position under bright floodlights. What do you need, Ava? There was a long silence before she finally whispered, "Everything is falling apart here." I closed my eyes slowly because deep down, I already knew exactly what she meant. And for the first time since leaving Chicago, I realized the past had finally caught up to the present. Ava sounded exhausted on the phone that night. Not dramatic, not emotional, just worn down in a way I had never heard before. "Dad," she whispered, "Mom is at St. Francis Medical Center." I sat motionless at the desk, inside my office while snow pressed softly against the garage windows outside. "What happened?" I asked quietly. Ava hesitated. "Stress. Her blood pressure crashed yesterday morning." I closed my eyes briefly. No matter what Diane had done, hearing she was in a hospital bed still hit something deep inside me. 39 years does not disappear overnight. "And Lucas?" I asked. Another silence. That is part of the problem. The tone in her voice told me enough before she even explained further. By sunrise the next morning, I was driving south through Wisconsin toward Chicago while freezing rain streaked across the windshield. The farther south I went, the heavier my chest felt. Not fear exactly. More like the strange, emotional weight of returning to a life that no longer fit me. When I finally pulled into the hospital parking garage downtown, I sat inside the truck for almost 10 minutes staring at the steering wheel. For weeks earlier, I would have rushed upstairs desperate to fix everybody's pain before my own. But something inside me had changed since then. I was not returning as the man they used to control. I was returning because I chose to. The hospital smelled like coffee, disinfectant, and exhaustion. Ava spotted me first near the elevators and immediately stood up from one of the waiting room chairs. Her eyes filled with tears the second she saw me. "Dad." For a moment, she looked like the little girl who used to wait by the front window every Friday night for me to come home from business trips carrying airport candy in my briefcase. She hugged me carefully. "You came." I nodded once. "How is your mother?" Ava rubbed her forehead tiredly. "Stable now." Then she lowered her voice. "But things here are bad." We walked slowly down the hallway together while nurses moved between rooms pushing carts under dim evening lights. "What happened after I left?" I asked. Ava exhaled shakily. "Everything started collapsing at once." She explained that within days of my disappearance, the board injunctions Martin filed froze several major transfers connected to Lucas's restructuring plans. Investors panicked. Auditors got involved. Then reporters started calling. After anonymous financial complaints surfaced online, Lucas kept saying he could handle it. Ava said quietly. But every day something else went wrong. We stopped outside Diane's hospital room before Ava looked directly at me for the first time. "Dad?" she whispered carefully. "Did you know the company lawyers were preparing criminal exposure reports?" I looked at her calmly. "Yes." Her face tightened instantly. "You knew all of this was coming?" I held her gaze for several seconds before answering. I knew the truth eventually catches up to people. Ava looked away like she did not know whether to feel angry, relieved, or ashamed. Inside the room, Diane looked smaller than I remembered. The strong, sharp-edged woman who used to control every family dinner conversation now sat quietly beneath pale hospital blankets, staring at snowfall outside the window. When she noticed me standing there, her eyes widened slightly. "Nathan." Her voice cracked on my name. I stepped inside slowly while Ava waited near the doorway. Diane swallowed hard. I did not think you would come. I pulled a chair beside the bed, but did not sit immediately. How are you feeling? She laughed weakly under her breath. That is probably not the question either of us really wants answered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Hospital monitors beeped softly in the background while snow drifted outside the glass. Finally, Diane looked down at her hands. Lucas says you were trying to destroy him. I stared at her quietly. Lucas spent a year preparing to erase me from my own life. Tears filled her eyes instantly. Nathan, things got out of control. I sat down slowly beside the bed. No, I replied calmly. Things got revealed. Before Diane could answer, the hospital room door suddenly opened again. Ava stiffened near the entrance. I turned slowly in the chair and saw Lucas standing there wearing an expensive charcoal overcoat, his jaw tense, his eyes locked directly on mine. And the moment our eyes met, I realized he still had absolutely no idea how much I already knew. Lucas stopped just inside the hospital room doorway, his expression carefully controlled, but I could still see exhaustion. Behind his eyes, his suit looked wrinkled for the first time in years, and the confidence he used to wear so naturally now seemed forced, like an actor trying to remember lines during the final scene of a play already falling apart. Dad, he said evenly, can we talk outside? I remained seated beside Diane's hospital bed. No, I replied calmly. Whatever you need to say can be said here. Ava shifted nervously near the window while Diane stared down at her blanket without speaking. Lucas slowly closed the door behind him and stepped further into the room. You froze company accounts during active negotiations, he said. Do you understand what kind of damage that caused? I looked at him quietly. I understand exactly what I prevented. His jaw tightened immediately. You are letting paranoia destroy everything this family built. For a moment the room fell silent except for the steady hospital monitor beside Diane's bed. Then I reached into my coat pocket and placed a thick folded document onto the tray table between us. Lucas's eyes dropped instantly toward the papers. What is that? He asked carefully. Forensic audit summaries, I answered, compiled by independent investigators over the last 2 weeks. Nobody moved. I watched Lucas carefully while the color slowly drained from his face. You hired investigators? Ava whispered. No, I replied calmly. The board did. Lucas immediately stepped forward. Dad, whatever numbers you think you saw can be explained. I looked directly at him. Can forged authorizations be explained? His expression hardened instantly. You do not understand how corporate restructuring works. I understand fraud very well. Diane finally looked up sharply. Nathan, please. But I kept my eyes on Lucas. The shell accounts in Milwaukee, the unauthorized loans, the diverted operating funds, the falsified signatures. Should I continue? Ava covered her mouth with her hand while Lucas stared at me without blinking. You already made your point, he said quietly. No, I replied. I have not. Then I reached into my briefcase beside the chair and removed another folder. Smaller this time. Red tab across the top. I slid it slowly. Onto the hospital tray beside the first set of papers. What is that? Diane asked nervously. I finally turned toward her. Federal correspondence. The room instantly changed. Even the air felt different after those 2 words. Lucas swallowed hard. What federal correspondence? I opened the folder calmly and removed a single page. 3 days ago, external auditors flagged several transactions tied to interstate transfer violations. Ava looked confused. What does that mean? I held the paper carefully between my fingers. It means investigators now believe company funds may have been moved through personal holding accounts connected to gambling debt. Diane's eyes widened in shock as she slowly turned toward Lucas. What? Lucas immediately shook his head. Dad is twisting things. But his voice no longer sounded steady. I stood up slowly for the first time since he entered the room. No, I said quietly. I protected you long enough for you to believe consequences were optional. Lucas stared at me with something I had never truly seen in him before. Fear. Real fear. You cannot prove any of that, he muttered. I looked directly into his eyes. I already did. Nobody spoke after that. Outside the hospital room window, snow drifted softly across downtown Chicago while the evening sky darkened above the city I spent 40 years helping build. Diane's breathing became uneven beside me. Ava sat down slowly in the corner chair like her legs suddenly could not hold her anymore. And Lucas? He looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time in his life. Not as the father who cleaned up disasters. Not as the old man he could manipulate. But as someone calm enough to let the truth destroy him without raising his voice once. Finally, Lucas spoke again, quieter this time. So what happens now? I picked up my coat from the chair beside the bed. That depends, I answered calmly. On whether you still think this is only about money. Then I turned toward the door. But before I could leave, Diane suddenly started crying softly into her hands and whispered something that stopped every person in that hospital room cold. Nathan, she said shakily, he was not the only one moving money. Diane's words hung in the hospital room like smoke nobody could clear away. Ava looked back and forth between us in complete disbelief, while Lucas immediately stepped toward the bed. Mom, he snapped under his breath, stop talking. But Diane did not stop. Years of pressure seemed to collapse out of her all at once. He needs to know, she whispered weakly. I remained standing beside the door holding my coat in one hand, while every instinct inside me told me to walk away before hearing anything else. But after months of lies, silence no longer felt like peace. It felt like surrender. Know what? I asked quietly. Diane wiped tears from her face with trembling fingers. Last year after your surgery, she said slowly. Lucas told me the company was heading toward disaster. I said nothing. He said investors were losing confidence. He said if we did not move assets early, everything you built could collapse. Ava stared at her mother in shock. Mom, what are you talking about? Diane looked ashamed for the first time since I entered the room. Lucas convinced me to transfer portions of our private reserve accounts into separate holdings under temporary family protection structures. Lucas immediately interrupted. That is not what happened. I turned toward him calmly. Then explain it. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out right away. That silence told me more than any confession could have. Diane spoke again quietly. At first I believed him. I thought he was trying to protect the family. Her breathing became uneven. But after a few months, the transfers got larger. Then there were cash withdrawals. Loans. Accounts I did not recognize. Ava sat frozen in the chair near the window. How much money? She whispered. Diane lowered her eyes. Almost $9 million passed through the accounts. The room went completely silent. Even Lucas looked pale now. Dad? Ava said shakily. Is that true? I answered honestly. I do not know the final number yet. Lucas suddenly stepped closer toward me, frustration breaking through his calm mask. You act like I stole everything for myself. I looked directly at him. Did you? His jaw tightened. I was trying to keep the company alive. No, I replied quietly. You were trying to keep control. For the first time in his life, Lucas had no fast answer waiting. No charm. No confidence. Just exhaustion and fear sitting openly on his face. Diane looked at me with tears running down her cheeks. Nathan, I never wanted this. I finally walked back toward the chair beside her bed and placed my coat down slowly. That may be true, I said calmly. But wanting comfort more than honesty still destroys people. She closed her eyes at those words like they physically hurt her. A soft knock interrupted the room before Martin Reyes stepped carefully inside, holding another folder against his chest. When he saw everyone standing there, he paused awkwardly. I can come back later. No, I said. Go ahead. Martin looked briefly toward Lucas before handing me the folder. The board voted 30 minutes ago, he explained quietly. Interim leadership authority has been fully restored to you effective immediately. Ava looked stunned. Wait, Dad is back in charge. Martin nodded once. Unanimously. Lucas turned away sharply toward the hospital window, both hands pressed against his hips. For years I probably would have felt satisfaction watching him lose control. But standing there in that room, all I really felt was sadness. Because none of this looked like victory anymore. It looked like the slow collapse of a family that stopped telling each other the truth a long time ago. Martin cleared his throat softly. There is one more thing. He handed me a sealed legal envelope. Federal investigators requested formal interviews beginning Monday morning. Diane covered her mouth instantly. Ava looked like she might cry again. Lucas stared silently out at the snow-covered Chicago skyline without turning around. I opened the envelope carefully and read the first page in silence while the room waited. Then I folded it closed again. I will cooperate fully, I said calmly. Lucas finally turned toward me again. Dad, his voice cracked slightly for the first time. I looked at him quietly. No, I said gently. You do not get to call me that right now. The words were not loud. They were not cruel. But the pain that crossed his face afterward stayed with me long after I left the hospital that night. Because even after everything he had done, part of me still hated seeing my son look broken. 6 months later, I was still living near the lake outside Bayfield. The winters were quieter there, slower. Most mornings I woke before sunrise, brewed coffee in the small kitchen overlooking the frozen shoreline, and watched the sky slowly turn silver across the water while freight trucks rolled into North Ridge's loading yard down the road. Life was not perfect. Some wounds do not disappear just because the truth finally comes out. But for the first time in decades, my life belonged to me again. The federal investigation eventually confirmed everything. Unauthorized transfers, fraudulent authorizations, hidden accounts. Lucas avoided prison through financial settlements and cooperation agreements, but he lost his executive position permanently. Most of the people who once surrounded him disappeared within weeks after the money and status vanished. Diane moved into a smaller condo near Milwaukee after we finalized a quiet divorce that never became ugly because by then we were both too exhausted to keep fighting ghosts. Ava still called me every Sunday evening. Slowly, carefully, we started rebuilding something honest between us. Emily visited twice that summer with her children, and for the first time in years, family conversations no longer felt like negotiations. As for coal freight logistics, I stepped down permanently 3 months after returning to stabilize the company. Not because I lost the ability to lead, because I finally understood that survival and peace are not always found in holding on. Sometimes they are found in learning how to let go without losing yourself. Frank and Caleb offered me partnership at Northridge that spring. Small company, honest people, real work. I accepted. Nothing fancy. No skyscraper office. No television interviews. Just freight routes, long mornings, diesel engines, snow-covered highways, and men who shook your hand like it still meant something. One afternoon in early October, Caleb walked into my office carrying a framed brass plate wrapped in brown paper. "Thought this belonged to you," he said. I opened it slowly and stared down at the old nameplate from my Chicago office. Nathan Cole, Chief Executive Officer. I ran my thumb across the scratched metal for a long moment before setting it gently inside the bottom drawer of my desk. Caleb looked surprised. "You do not want to hang it?" I smiled faintly. "No," I said quietly. That man spent too much of his life believing his value came from carrying everyone else. Later that evening, I walked alone down to the lake, carrying my father's old military watch in my coat pocket. The same watch that once sat in a velvet box during the night, everything inside my family finally shattered open. I stood near the shoreline while cold wind moved across the water and slowly held the watch in my hand beneath the fading sunset. For years I thought strength meant sacrifice without limits. That love meant enduring disrespect quietly. That being needed was the same thing as being valued. I was wrong. Boundaries are not cruelty. Protecting yourself is not selfish. And sometimes God, or life, or the universe, whatever you choose to call it, removes people from your path not to punish you, but to return you to yourself before you disappear completely. If you are listening to this right now while carrying pain inside your own family, I want you to hear me clearly. You do not need to destroy yourself just to prove you are loyal. Love should not require you to abandon your dignity. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Protect your finances. Protect your peace. Protect the quiet voice inside you that still knows your worth even after others stop recognizing it. Healing does not happen all at once. Some days you still wake up angry. Some days sad. Some days lonely. But little by little, if you stop begging people to treat you with basic respect and start standing beside yourself instead, life becomes lighter again. My name is Nathan Cole. I am 74 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never hand people so much power that they can convince you your kindness is weakness. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Truly, somewhere out there, maybe somebody listening tonight needed to hear that it is still possible to rebuild after betrayal. Maybe somebody needed to know they are not crazy for finally choosing themselves. And maybe somebody needed the reminder that losing people who only loved your usefulness is not the same thing as losing your value. Before I left the shoreline that evening, I opened my hand one last time and looked down at my father's watch resting quietly against my palm while the sun disappeared beyond the lake. Then I smiled softly, slipped the watch back into my pocket, and walked home feeling lighter than I had in years. If this story stayed with you tonight, you will probably connect deeply with the next stories waiting in this playlist too. There are more families, more hidden truths, more quiet moments where ordinary people finally stop losing themselves trying to save everyone else. Sometimes the next story arrives exactly when we need it most. And sometimes listening to somebody else survive reminds us that maybe we can survive too.